The Cosford Airshow returned in 2022 after a 3-year hiatus to become the first military-run airshow to be held in the UK since the pandemic. 3 international military contributions bolstered the flying lineup, including the French Air Force's Rafale C and an outstanding display by Belgium's new F-16 display pilot, Captain Stephen de Vries. The RAF contributed strongly, with all of their main display teams, plus rarely seen performances such as the Spitfire and Typhoon synchro pair, and a flypast by the F-35. And historic helicopters made a strong showing, with 4 aircraft present, including the debut of their Lynx AH.7. This is our pick of the action.
Hello from RAF Cosford, the first Cosford Airshow in 3 years, which is the subject of this episode of Airshow Dispatches. A couple of things that I particularly am looking out for that I hope you'll really enjoy. Belgian F-16, debut of their new Viper-themed paint scheme with a display that I'm told is very, very good this year. A lot of negative G flying in there. And the other thing that has been a bit of a surprise when we turned up this morning, there's a Lynx out on the flight line. That's historic helicopter's newly restored Lynx AH.7, a surprise addition to the flying lineup. It will be its first public airshow appearance, and indeed the first public appearance in a flying display of any Lynx here in the UK, or any Lynx AH.7 I should say, since 2014. I hope you enjoy the show over the next hour or so, and we start with the Royal Air Force Falcons.
So here they are, the RAF Falcons, jumping from a Royal Air Force Chinook HC-6A, which is rather nice to see. They more usually jump from their own civilian-registered Dornier 228. They'll form up into that trademark Falcons stack, an 8-man stack on this occasion, and then split into 2 groups of 4 to commence the carousel. Due to low cloud, this isn't the full Falcons show. There are 3 manoeuvres they can perform this year: the Heart, the Carousel and the Sabre Chase. If you join me for the previous episode of Airshow Dispatches, you'll have seen the Heart followed by the Sabre Chase. In this case, it's the Carousel followed by the Sabre Chase, the Carousel being an entirely new manoeuvre introduced in 2021 to mark the team's 60th anniversary. Last year, the Falcons were a pretty rare sight on the airshow circuit. They only did 2 public airshows, although of course they participated in plenty of non-aviation events. This year's show has been streamlined rather a lot, especially the pre-jump checks and dummy runs, which should make the team much easier to slot into a rigidly scheduled air display, and they are indeed due to perform at many more airshows this year than they participated in last season. And now we'll see the Chinook's solo display. This is a Chinook HC-6A, the earliest of which were introduced as far back as 1981, then known as the HC-1. They are what the Americans would call the CH-47D. The fleet has been steadily upgraded through the years, most recently from HC4 to HC6A standard, which brings the aircraft roughly in line with the RAF's newest HC6s by adding Boeing's digital automatic flight control system. The RAF is the largest foreign operator of the Chinook, and the bulk of the fleet is made up of HC6A aircraft like this one. There are 38 of those. They also field 8 HC5s, which are roughly equivalent to the MH-64E, and 14 HC6s, the newest aircraft in the fleet, and that is the UK designation for the CH-47F. Let's talk about the display sequence. It's a new display this year, designed by this year's display pilot, Flight Lieutenant Matthew Smythe. Among the changes is the quick stop now being performed on the B axis towards the crowd rather than on the A axis, and you're about to see that now. The Chinook fleet is set to be bolstered in the coming years with the arrival of 14 Block 2 H-47ER Chinooks, optimised for special operations. That order was announced last year, with the first aircraft due to arrive in 2026. That will make the UK the first overseas operator of the Chinook Block 2. Like the Falcons, the Chinook also had a rather sparse season last year, not getting their public display authority until mid-August and only participating in 3 events. This will once again be a much busier season for them, with 12 events planned, including international appearances in Germany and France. So we'll move on now to another of the RAF's regular display teams, the Typhoon FGR-4. But at selected shows in 2022, we're getting a little more than the standard solo display, because the aircraft is arriving in formation with one of the fighters from the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. In this case, it's a Spitfire Mark IIA. The last time we saw this formation was in 2015. It was known back then as the Synchro 75 pair, with the Typhoon painted up in Battle of Britain style camouflage. On that occasion they performed a full 10-minute display, which included formation flybys, opposition passes and synchronised aerobatics. This is effectively the first half of that Synchro pair display, 3 passes in formation followed by a break. Good to see a special scheme on the Typhoon, even if it's not full camouflage. It's the Blackjack scheme, which has been applied to the primary display aircraft for the 2021 and 2022 display seasons. Now, following the break, the Typhoon launches into its solo routine flown this year by Flight Lieutenant Adam O'Hare. Each year's display pilot constructs their own display routine from a selection of a couple of dozen approved manoeuvres. Last year's show put a lot of focus on pointing either the nose of the aircraft or the afterburner towards the spectators, while this year's demonstration is more oriented around showing off the aircraft's high speed. And it's probably fair to say it's not quite such a compact performance as last year's show. We'll see a few of these over the next hour. A negative G outside turn. The Typhoon is stressed to -3G. On the positive side, the Typhoon can sustain 9G, which is fairly typical of frontline fighter aircraft of the past few decades. But where the Typhoon and other more recently designed aircraft excel compared to their predecessors is the G onset rate, which for the Typhoon is around about 10 Gs per second. That's almost double that of the F-16 and the Legacy Hornet. Another very uncomfortable negative G push there with fuel venting from the tail. The vent is there to allow air to escape from the tanks during air-to-air refuelling, but during these negative G manoeuvres, fuel is forced up the transfer lines to that vent where some of it escapes. You'll see a similar phenomenon from the likes of the F5 and Super Hornet, albeit not at this event. This particular aircraft started out in life as a Typhoon F2, but it has been known as a Typhoon FGR4 since 2008. That name change represents the increases in its capabilities since it was introduced to service. The G stands for ground attack and the R for reconnaissance. Now the aircraft will descend into a high G 360-degree turn. The Typhoon has so much power available to it that even in a 9G turn, with the afterburners on, it will continue to accelerate. So as those thrust buckets go out of sight, the afterburner will be disengaged, and watch for the puff of brown smoke as they are ignited, just before they come back into view. And there it is. And that's the sort of thing that we perhaps don't think about when we're watching these displays. They can't just leave the aircraft in full reheat all the time, so that power use has to be very carefully managed, ensuring the aircraft doesn't overspeed, while at the same time making sure that we in the crowd are exposed to that power at the most effective moments. You might be wondering whether you'll get to see any more of that Spitfire that was flying around with the Typhoon earlier. Well, the answer is yes, and here it is flying with a second Spitfire, an LF-9E, from the Battle of Britain Memorial flight. The Mark 9 is in the lead, painted in desert camouflage that represents a Spitfire Mark 9 of 92 Squadron, which served in Tunisia in 1943. The Mark IIA, which we saw earlier, is painted up as a Battle of Britain era Mark I from 54 Squadron, known as Kiwi 3, as it was flown by New Zealander Al Deer. The plan had been for the Lancaster to join the two fighters for the traditional three-ship BBMF display, similar to what we saw at the Midlands Air Festival in the previous episode. Sadly, a technical hitch precluded that from happening, and while the Dakota might normally have stepped in to fill the gap, that aircraft is currently undergoing some fairly major maintenance at the moment, and so is not available for displays this season. Now, I reckon this is a pretty aviation-savvy audience that is watching this video, and there's probably not much that I can tell you about the Spitfire that you don't already know, so I'll just let you enjoy the sound of a Merlin 66 engine for a while. We'll continue working our way through the RAF contributions at the show, and next up, a trio of Tutor T1s from the University of Birmingham Air Squadron. Based at Cosford, UBAS is one of the largest university air squadrons in the country, with around 75 students. We'll see a bit more of the Tutor now, courtesy of Flight Lieutenant David John Gibbs, who is flying this year's Tutor solo display. The display comes from 115 Squadron, which is very appropriate because this aircraft is known outside the RAF as the Grob 115E. It's part of No. 6 Flight Training School, the RAF's largest training unit, and the squadron is primarily responsible for training qualified flying instructors. The 3 Tutors we saw a moment ago were in the standard RAF colour scheme, but this one wears an experimental yellow and black scheme, one of several experimental schemes which the RAF applied to some of its Tutors a few years back to gauge which one is most visible from other aircraft. This one is very much reminiscent of the old Slingsby Fireflies, which were phased out in 2010. Although the Tutor has been in service for less than 25 years, it has been replaced in the elementary flight training role already by the much newer Grob 120TP, known in the RAF as the Prefect T1. It has a turboprop engine, digital avionics and a glass cockpit, which prepares students much better for aircraft like the Texan, Hawk and Phenom, onto which they will graduate. Now, when you think about the Royal Air Force and air shows, inevitably the Red Arrows come to mind. And of course, they were at Cosford too. It's been fairly well publicised by now, but the Red Arrows are flying only 7 aircraft this year due to the departure of 2 pilots from the team at separate intervals in the run-up to this year's display season. This necessitated a lot of last-minute changes to the display routine to make it workable, with pilots swapping positions within the formation, the order of the manoeuvres changing quite substantially, and several moves being cut altogether. It certainly resulted in a less impressive show than we are used to seeing, but in the circumstances, they've done impressively well to give us even this more limited performance. Here is the crowd favourite Tornado manoeuvre, introduced in 2016 but improved over subsequent seasons to give us the manoeuvre that we all know and love today. One of the signs that the Reds have had a difficult winter is that Detonator is used to open the second half of the show in the full display. It's traditionally part of the flat and rolling shows, but it's usually replaced by something more exciting in the full show. But for the sake of simplicity, here it is being used in the full show this year, which is something that also happened in the pandemic-stricken 2020 season, as well as in 2010 and 2012. The Red Arrows perform plenty of barrel rolls over the course of their display, but usually along the A axis where you can't see that graceful barrel shape. This manoeuvre, Python, was introduced in 2007. It's a pair of barrel rolls oriented such that the crowd can see the curvature of the manoeuvre, and the team will cover 6 miles of ground track over the course of the manoeuvre. Apologies about that. I can only assume that the child you can hear has noticed there are 2 aircraft missing and has taken it a bit too seriously. A glimpse of Ian from Plains TV there. My thanks to him, by the way, for being the chauffeur for the weekend, but also for lend of a tripod that was very much better than the one I usually use. That's why this footage is quite a bit better than normal. It's all in the tripod. Here's a manoeuvre that was introduced just in 2020, the rolling heart, designed to ensure that the heart can be performed even when there's relatively low cloud around that would normally obscure it. The decision whether to use white smoke or red smoke during the heart is made by Red 10 as the display unfolds, based on which colour he thinks will stand out best against the current cloud conditions. And now the final manoeuvre, and it's one that only really makes sense if you view it from exactly head on, but luckily that is what we are doing. It's the infinity brake. It wasn't just the RAF's regular display teams that we saw at the show. We also got some extremely welcome flypasts by 3 rarely seen RAF assets. Aside from the Trooping the Colour flypast, this is the very first flying display appearance of the T6C Texan II, or the Texan T1 as the RAF call it, which was introduced in 2019 to replace the Tucano T1. And now a pair of Hawk T2s. Like the Texan, they come from RAF Valley, where they form part of No. 4 Flight Training School. Our final RAF participant has been seen at a handful of air shows before, but this is its Cosford debut. It's the only aircraft in the RAF not to have been given a British military aircraft designation. It's known here by its American designation, the F-35B Lightning, although without the 2 suffix, because it's actually the 3rd aircraft called the Lightning to be operated by the RAF. That is something we're not going to get bored of seeing anytime soon, or hearing for that matter. It's quite loud. But now a total change of noise level, because we've got an aircraft here that isn't technically part of the RAF, but it is RAF affiliated because it comes from the RAF Shawbury Gliding Club, which until 2020 was actually based here at Cosford. The pilot is the club's chief flying instructor, Ian Gallagher, known to all as Gally. And the aircraft is a K-21, a very widely used glider for training duties, cross-country flying and, yes, aerobatics. I've had the privilege of doing some glider aerobatics with Gally, and it's quite alarming how quickly you do burn through your height. This is a display that can last no longer than about 3 minutes, 4 at a push, with an average descent rate of 1,000 feet per minute. There's a lot of energy management involved, as you can probably imagine, especially when it comes to the latter stages of the flight, because there's only one shot at the approach and landing. But needless to say, Gally, who is one of the UK's foremost glider display pilots, did an excellent job and was nominated by the Flying Control Committee as a runner-up for the award for the best display. Another display to be highly commended by the Flying Control Committee was the absolutely delightful vintage pair with their 2 chipmunks. They pay tribute to a former RAF display team of the same name, which flew a chipmunk and a vampire, and so, very aptly, one of their chipmunks, the T-10, is in RAF colours.
No, not yet over, but we will contact the flight operator.
The other, the silver T-20, is in the colours of the Portuguese Air Force, which is the sole remaining operator of the Chipmunk. They've been flying them since 1951, and they still have a limited role in pilot selection today, having been substantially upgraded through the years with new radios, engines, brakes, transponders and so on. It's really not difficult to see why the FCC were quite so keen on this performance, because it is a very compact display indeed, and what you can't see in this footage, because of how tight it is that there are some very slick rejoins in there as well, all the more impressive given these aircraft don't have any air brakes. A very photogenic opposition brake concludes that performance now. And so we move on to one of the best known acts on the UK airshow circuit, Rich Goodwin with a highly modified aeroplane known as the Jet Pitts. It's got the fuselage of a Pitts S2S, but high-performance, custom-designed wings, massive control surfaces, a modified AEIO 540 engine putting out in excess of 320 horsepower, and a place to mount 2 further engines, a pair of Lynx turbojets, on either side of the nose, and that will give the aircraft a thrust-to-weight ratio of greater than 1:1. As well as Rich Goodwin himself, the project is being spearheaded by Eddie Sauerman, who designed the Yak 110 and Jet Wacko over in the United States. The aircraft has flown with the two jets attached, and it has run those engines on the ground, but it's yet to fly with the jets running while in the air, and I believe it's mainly delays of a bureaucratic nature at this stage. Now Rich hangs the aircraft on the prop. It's so close, so very close to being able to hover already, but with the added power of the two jets, it will not only be able to hover indefinitely, or at least until the fuel runs out, it should also be able to accelerate upwards out of the hover. Halfway through the display, Rich pauses briefly to gain some height and cool down the engine before diving in once again and then pulling into the vertical for a series of upward rolls, which he calls the Tower of Power. Aileron rolls initially, then some snap rolls, and as the aircraft decelerates, it becomes a torque roll, using the torque of the engine to maintain that rotation, even with zero airspeed, negative airspeed in fact, as he falls backwards for a remarkably long time through his own smoke trail. We turn back to the military now, and our first overseas guest, the Rafale C from the French Air and Space Force, the Armée de l'Air et de l'Espace. This is known to be one of the premier fast-jet solo displays in the world. There is almost no point during the roughly 9-minute performance when the jet isn't either pulling a lot of G or rolling very rapidly. The Rafale's roll performance is exceptional. In a clean configuration, it's limited by the flight control software to 270 degrees per second, which is faster than any comparable aircraft type. And the speed of roll onset is also unparalleled. We saw a negative G turn from the Typhoon earlier. Here is the Rafale's example, showing off its special paint scheme. All three of the fast jets at the Cosford Airshow had a special scheme. This one was rolled out in early May, and it will be the primary Rafale solo display aircraft for the 2022 season only. We should see a new scheme next year. This is a C-model Rafale upgraded to the very latest F3 configuration, which mainly refers to its enhanced compatibility with various weapons systems. The next set of upgrades will bring the fleets to F4-1 standard, which will transform the Rafale from a 4th generation fighter to a 4.5 generation fighter, with helmet viewfinder capacity, as well as integration with the MICA anti-air multi-target fire and forget missile, and the upcoming 1,000 kilogram version of the AASL precision guided bomb. An excellent display from the Rafale, as we would expect, but we're going to look at some ex-military aircraft in the next segment, starting with a pair of rotorcraft from Historic Helicopters. That organisation is a very prolific restorer and operator of classic rotorcraft based down in Somerset, and it has shot to prominence over the past 10 years or so, having been almost singularly responsible for the renaissance of classic helicopters that we are currently enjoying on the UK airshow circuit. They brought 4 such aircraft to the Cosford Airshow, a Sea King HAR-3A and a Whirlwind HAR-10 for the static display, and 2 more aircraft for the flying, including this one, the Wessex HU-5. HU-5 denotes this was a utility version of the Wessex, as opposed to an anti-submarine or search and rescue version. Like most of the larger Westland products, it was a license-built version of a Sikorsky design, the H-34 Choctaw in this case. And it's very appropriate to be seeing this aircraft included in the Cosford flying display in this of all years, because the show marked 40 years since the conflict in the Falklands. 55 Wessex HU-5s participated in that conflict and were used mainly to insert and extract Special Forces troops. A Wessex was also involved in the sinking of the Santa Fe, which is an incident that we discussed in the previous episode. Good to see it here in the Platinum Jubilee year too, because the Wessex also has a history of operating with the Queen's flight, and both Prince Philip and Prince Charles were trained to fly the type. But if there was one historic helicopter asset that drew more attention than any other, then it was the Lynx AH.7, newly restored, only making its first flight in November of last year, and this was its surprise flying display debut in the hands of the owner of historic helicopters, Andrew Whitehouse. The AH-7 was the Army version of the Lynx, which served only with the UK Army and the Qatari police force. This version of the Lynx was fully aerobatic, capable of loops and rolls thanks to its rigid rotor head, and particularly in the hands of Blue Eagles display pilots from the Army Air Corps, it was famous for performing a manoeuvre called the backflip at UK airshows, up until the type's retirement in 2015. Sadly, that's not something that is permitted in civilian hands, but still a fairly sprightly display nonetheless. The Lynx saw considerably more export success in its naval variants, having been operated by 16 navies around the world. Although the last Lynx in UK service, the HMA-8, was retired in 2017, it lives on through its newer and more capable derivative, the Wildcat, which is one of the premier shipborne helicopters ever produced. The Lynx was actively used in combat during the Falklands War and again in the Gulf War and the Kosovo War, helped perhaps by its impressive turn of speed. The Lynx set the world helicopter airspeed record in 1986 at 250 miles an hour, and that's a record that remains unbeaten to this day. Going back a little further, and we have another aircraft type that was used extensively in the naval environment. It's plain sailing's PBY-5A Catalina, actually technically a Canzo A, as this one was built under licence in Canada. And it's flown today by Angelo Cunningham, part of a syndicate of pilots and enthusiasts who own and operate this wonderful aircraft, keeping it very active on the airshow circuit indeed. This may be an aircraft that rose to prominence for its very distinguished anti-submarine, anti-shipping and search and rescue roles in the Second World War, but incredibly, it's one that still saw a certain amount of utility until fairly recently, continuing to serve with the Brazilian Air Force into the 1980s and being used for firefighting duties by various civilian operators into the 21st century. Our final Warbird of the programme is P-51D Mustang Warhorse, owned by Warbird Experiences, but displayed for us today by Alistair Williams of the Rolls-Royce Heritage Flight. Now, before we talk about the aircraft, take a look at this barrel roll. As the aircraft descends through the 270-degree mark, there's a quite noticeable venting of vapour emanating from somewhere on the left-hand side of the fuselage. It's not something I've ever seen a Mustang do before, and I can't work out what it is. Neither can anyone I've asked about it. So if you know more about Mustangs than I do, and you have an idea what's caused it, I'll be very interested to hear about it in the comments section. This is an aeroplane that has had a long association with the Cosford Airshow, initially displaying as Old Crow, but then as the Shark when it wore RAF camouflage with a shark mouth on the nose. Its most recent scheme was applied in 2020, and it depicts the aircraft flown by Colonel Don Blakesley. With 15.5 aerial kills to his name, as well as 2 more on the ground, he flew more combat missions than any other American fighter pilot in the Second World War, and was the commanding officer for the 4th Fighter Group of the US Army Air Forces. We're going to let the Belgian Air Force entertain us for the final segment of this programme now, and they brought 2 acts to the Cosford Airshow 2022. The first is the A109 solo display, arriving here on the B-axis and pitching up to 40 degrees, then throwing in 50 degrees of bank for what we'd call a wing over if it were a fixed wing aeroplane, reducing the power to 50% as it completes the turn. Like the fast jets in the programme, this aircraft wears a special airshow colour scheme known as Razzle Blades. The aim, according to the Belgian Air Force, was for a contemporary and modern look that would help narrow the gap between young people and the defence establishment. Pitching up again for a pedal turn this time, applying a bootful of pedal, but unlike in a fixed-wing aeroplane, this doesn't apply rudder, rather it varies the speed of the tail rotor, which thus causes the helicopter to yaw. Belgium purchased the A109 in 1988 to replace the Alouette 2 in the armed reconnaissance and observation roles, but their duties have since been expanded to include anti-tank missions, tactical support, medical evacuations and light transport. They aren't exactly young airframes though, and earlier this year Belgium announced the intention to replace the A109, with the Airbus H145 being seen as the front-runner to supersede it. More pedal turning here, this time in level flight, the helicopter rotating on its axis as it passes down the crowd line. And we shall now move on to our final display of the day, and the second Belgian contribution to the flying programme. It was also the very deserving winner of the Bill Hartree Trophy for the most entertaining flying display. It is the F-16 AM Fighting Falcon. And we have saved the best until last because this is a quite extraordinary demonstration, as you would expect, given not only Belgium's strong form in displaying the F-16, but also the fact that this year's display pilot is Captain Stephen de Vries, the most experienced F-16 pilot outside the United States. The first of 3 extreme negative G manoeuvres there, which will see Captain de Vries endure sustained forces of up to -4G. That's impressive in itself, but it's even more so when you see that in the space of just a second or two, he's switched back into high load factor positive G flight. Very high G, but also sustained very high alpha as well. A flight regime in which the F-16 performs particularly well. Take a freeze frame, draw some lines on it, and that very crude measurement would suggest that there are about 30 degrees of alpha during that manoeuvre. And watch now for the most impressive manoeuvre of the display. I've certainly never seen a frontline fighter do this before. A 45-degree climb and get ready for the push. That's outrageous! Rarely do I get this excited about an airshow performance, but that is exceptional. Think about what we've just seen, a 225-degree push into an inverted pass. You could perhaps call it an outside split S, and if you think he's done, he's not, because here comes another 45-degree climb into a hard outside turn. A new paint scheme as well, of course, known as the Dream Viper. This will be the team's primary display aircraft for the next 3 years, so we'll have plenty of time to enjoy it. And a nice touch, note the small Union flag on the right stabilator. That will be replaced by the flag of whichever country the jet is displaying in. Whilst they've been extensively upgraded and are basically equivalent to the Block 50 C model F-16s, there's no getting around the fact that these are very old airframes. In 2018, the country decided to buy 34 F-35As to replace their roughly 50 F-16s, the first of which is due to arrive in 2024, so enjoy this. Enjoy this while it lasts, because it won't be around forever. What a way to end our look back at the Cosford Airshow 2022. Our thanks to the organisers for hosting us and to Planes TV for their help over the weekend. It was a terrific show and we had a wonderful time. We're heading all over the world in this series of airshow dispatches, and I hope you'll join us for the next one from the new airshow in France, themed around the Normandy Yemen. That'll be along in late July, but until then, thank you very much for joining. From me, Adam Landau, it's goodbye for now.